Hey y'all. So today we are talking all about fermentation. What is the process and why is it important in energy conversion when there is not oxygen available? So there are three questions we're going to be able to answer by the end of today's lesson, which is what are the types of fermentation? What are the advantages and disadvantages of fermentation? Because there's both. And then which process, fermentation or cellular respiration, is better for ATP production? And we're going to go ahead and answer those questions today. But before we go into fermentation, we have to recap cellular respiration so that we can compare these two processes to be able to answer that question. Cellular respiration is the process that breaks down glucose to make ATP energy so that our cells can function. And this occurs in the mitochondria, and a picture of that is here. So as we can see in the formula, the reactants of respiration is that the cell will take in oxygen and glucose, and it's going to make carbon dioxide, water, and ATP energy. Because again, the whole purpose is taking this glucose here and to make the energy so the cell can function. We also learned in the previous video that cellular respiration occurs in three stages. The first stage of cellular respiration is glycolysis. The second stage is the Krebs cycle. And the third stage is the electron transport chain, which sometimes we see as oxidative phosphorylation. Those are the three stages in which we take in these reactants and make these products. And of course, each of these stages creates energy. We also learned in the last video that these stages can be classified as one of two things. They can either be classified as an aerobic process or an anaerobic process, meaning aerobic, that this process functions when oxygen is present. And if it's anaerobic, this process functions when oxygen is not present. So when we look at our three stages, starting with our first one, glycolysis is an anaerobic process. That means it can make these two ATPs when oxygen is not present. The Krebs cycle and electron transport chain, they are both aerobic processes. This means that they only work when oxygen is present. So that means when oxygen is present, the Krebs cycle will be able to make 2 more ATP and 32 to 34 ATP with the electron transport chain. Now, where does fermentation dive into this? There are two pathways our body is going to take based on the amount of oxygen we have present. As you can see in this diagram, we're going to start with glucose always, right? Because the whole process is to take in glucose to make energy. But if oxygen is present, it's going to go an aerobic route. And if oxygen is not present, it's going to go an anaerobic route. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We have learned about the aerobic route, which is cellular respiration, in the last video. Today, we're going to talk about the anaerobic route, that when oxygen is not present. What happens when oxygen is not available? And we are always going to start with the process glycolysis. So glycolysis is going to take in this glucose molecule and it's going to make a product called pyruvate. Based on the amount of oxygen available, it is going to choose a pathway. So if oxygen is present, it's going to go our aerobic route, which means it's going to go with the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. And we know that this makes up to 36 ATP. So when there's oxygen available, we make a lot of ATP. However, when oxygen is not present, when your internal oxygen concentration is lower, then it's going to go through the process from glycolysis to fermentation. And there are two types of fermentation. You have lactic acid and ethanol or alcohol fermentation. And I don't have a box here, but this will result in 2 ATP. So already we can see that there's a difference between the amount of ATP available when there is oxygen present and when there is not oxygen present. So what is fermentation? Fermentation is an anaerobic process that occurs after glycolysis if oxygen is not available, but the body still needs energy or ATP. There are two types of fermentation. You have lactic acid and you have alcoholic or ethanol fermentation. Here's what we want to name. Fermentation produces less ATP, specifically 2 ATP only, at a quicker time compared to cellular respiration. So I want you to think about this. What is the advantage and disadvantage of this? It makes less ATP. However, the advantage is that it does it at a quicker time. We know that respiration from our last diagram makes approximately 36 ATP. And I want you to think about it like gold. It's quicker to make 2 bars of gold than to make 36 bars of gold. However, if at the end of the process we have 36 bars of gold, that is way more valuable resource. We have more to use for the different functions we want this process and to cellular respiration, because yeah, it makes more ATP, but it does it at a much slower rate. So now we're going to go into the types of fermentation specifically. Let's start with lactic acid. Lactic acid, as we can see in this diagram, is going to start with 2 pyruvate and 2 NADH, which we know are electron carriers. And it's going to make, that's our arrow, 2 NAD plus and 2 lactic acid. So that's our reactants and that's our products. Animals produce lactic acid when they're undergoing strenuous exercise. So going back to the example of the different sorts of athletes that you can be. When you exercise, if you ever wake up the next day and you're like a little bit sore, that's because your body was in a state of fermentation. Specifically, it was in the process of lactic acid fermentation, because when you build up lactic acid in your muscles, this actually causes the soreness that you feel. Like, yes, you're ripping muscles and the lactic acid buildup causes your muscles to be sore. So that's how you know your internal environment had less oxygen in your body to be in survival mode, switch from respiration to fermentation. To name for prokaryotes, which we know are bacteria, they produce lactic acid as well, but instead it's used for dairy products. So if you eat cheese, yogurt, buttermilk, sour cream, pickles, kimchi, okay, that is due to the process of lactic acid fermentation. So the only reason we get those is because we put these products in an environment where we decrease the amount of oxygen to cause it to ferment, and therefore we get these tasty products that we are showing here. The next type of fermentation we're going to talk about is alcoholic fermentation. As we can see in this diagram down here, the 2 reactants are 2 pyruvate and 2 NADH. Notice how it's the same, but the products are different. The products are NADH, carbon dioxide, and 2-ethanol or alcohol. When it comes to yeast and other microorganisms, they use alcoholic fermentation to produce ethyl alcohol and carbon dioxide. Here's how we know, because like I mentioned with lactic acid, you know that you did that if you feel like that soreness from working out. Well, how do we know if alcoholic fermentation happened? We know if it happened based on carbon dioxide. So for instance, if you ever seen a video or show or something and they pour beer, they open up a can of beer and they pour it and you see all the bubbles forming. Bubbles show evidence of carbon dioxide. If you take a bubble and blow, that is evidence that carbon dioxide was released, and therefore you have the bubble. It's the same with if you ever see bubble in wine, or if you were like baking bread and you see like the bubbles or holes inside the bread. The release of carbon dioxide lets us know that alcohol fermentation happened because we see carbon dioxide present and also ethyl alcohol. So some examples is when they're trying to make beer or wine or cider, yeast to make bread or cake. All those things use alcoholic fermentation. Again, fermentation is an anaerobic process that happens after glycolysis. It is going to make 2 ATP, which is a disadvantage. However, the advantage of doing fermentation is that we get those 2 ATP a lot quicker than if we did cellular respiration. And the 2 types are lactic acid and alcoholic fermentation. We know that these things occur because in alcoholic fermentation, we're going to see evidence of those bubbles to show carbon dioxide. And for lactic acid, we should see the presence of lactic acid or soreness if you're using it for working out, to show that these things happen. Well, that is all for fermentation, and I will see you at the next video. Bye.